Awesome. Cool. So welcome everybody. Welcome Joe, who's on the call, and anybody else that sort of folds up a little bit later. And if you're watching this via the Facebook group, streaming live or replay, oh, here comes Christian, then welcome. So I am joined today by Eric Harbour, who, just a little sort of side note, is the partner of one of our alumni students from I think the first round, I'm not sure, the first or second round that we did, Lorena. And Lorena and I were talking a few weeks ago, and she just happened to drop into the conversation that her partner was doing a sort of PhD as a researcher in wearable technology, but really specifically looking at breathing and running, and this whole kind of combination of like wearable apps and breathing and runners, and quite specifically, you mentioned, or Lorena mentioned, that you were a little bit more focused on women than men.
Yes, yep, absolutely.
Yeah, so really specific and really cool, really niche, and obviously has a lot of knowledge and wisdom to share. So I'm really excited. Thank you so much, Eric, for being here and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with our crew. So how this is going to roll is I'm going to have Eric just talk a little bit about his background, like why he is where he is, how he got there, what he's currently doing, like what he is sort of learning and researching, and then we'll get into some kind of specifics around like breath and running and breath and sport and some, really tangible things. And then we'll open it up to questions. So if you're on Zoom and you want to ask Eric a question or two towards the end, then you're totally welcome. You can either just sort of unmute yourself towards the end when we say, or you can write in the chat as we go along. I will continue to keep an eye on Facebook. So if any of you are watching this on Facebook and you want to write a question beneath the video, I will sort of keep checking in and see if there's anything there. So Eric, first off, like over to you, like just give us a little bit about your sort of your background, like why have you ended up doing what you're doing?
So I wouldn't say it's an accident, but it definitely wasn't on purpose necessarily. Although the pieces, I don't know, looking back, like the pieces make sense how it fell into place. I mean, growing up, I was an athlete. I ran cross country for almost 10 years. So I was definitely a runner, but as well played almost every other sport possible, football, baseball, hockey, alpine skiing, which I ended up doing all through college, all through university. And in my bachelor's, ended up studying athletic training. So I really just at the end of my high school gotten into sport. I studied, what is to the rest of the world sports physio. And in that sports medicine space, although very interesting, I also felt it was quite limited, and always had some kind of side projects going on. And I had the amazing opportunity to work with a bunch of, NCAA D1 athletes and across football, basketball, a couple other sports. And then after that, kind of transitioned to, I worked with the ski team in Colorado for about 4 years and was the strength conditioning coach, as well as the athletic trainer for this team. And that was a really great opportunity as well. Eventually even felt that was a little limited and needed to go get a master's degree. So I went to New Zealand. I worked with the Olympic kayak team there doing a project in instrumented paddle device. So again, in wearable tech and sports biomechanics, as well was working with a professional women's rugby team, which was really cool opportunity. And then somehow met somebody there that brought me to where I am now, which is Salzburg, Austria, incredible place, on this industry science collaborative project with Adidas, Sunto, Atomic, Red Bull. And we're really looking at sensor technology across a myriad of sports. So for me, mostly we're looking at running in women and trying to potentially improve the relationship between runners and wearables, and somehow how we can improve the experience of running. So not necessarily performance, which is where I was more before, but now more in the experience. So in the psychological kind of journey of running, and potentially how we can improve that the recreational runner, which is really cool. So looking back, those things are very different, and they were purposeful for a variety of reasons that I thought I wanted to get to in my own professional career. But it really allowed me to see some context in the running now that perhaps some of our peers don't have, and connecting those things, seeing the medical side, seeing the performance side, and now having the tech side and bringing psychology into that has been a really cool opportunity to kind of blend all these different faces of sport into one and try and improve it for everybody.
Amazing. And I love that, as you said, like that real kind of combination, like bringing in all these different areas, right? And this is, I feel like where so much of this is going is like so holistic, right? It's, as you say, like what I found really interesting what you shared was this thing of like, what, I did this and then I felt that I wasn't quite satisfied, like there was something more. And I feel that that is a lot of the reason why a lot of our students are here right now, is because, they are professionals, they are therapists or counselors or coaches or whatever. And they're like, there's just something else. There's something else that I feel like I'm not quite able to offer to people. I don't quite understand the full scope of something. And they've turned to breath work to be that thing. So I really love that you're also doing the same, but in a kind of different kind of sector, right? You're bringing in tech and the wearables into that. And one of the things that we spoke about the other day, because we had a little chat a few days back, was that you were talking about sort of the wearable tech and how to actually make it more useful. Because at the moment there's not really a wild usefulness in a lot of the wearable tech.
Right. Yeah. So that was really the impetus for this project in many ways. Companies and runners, and in our case, Adidas was looking at a lot of user data, in this case from young female runners specifically, that a lot of us wear this, right? Or a lot of us carry one of these on our run or all day and whatever, and they're extremely amazingly powerful computers that can collect and analyze so much data, but ultimately we're really not using it for what it can do. And the number one thing this feeds back to us when we're running, for example, heart rate is what a lot of people are paying attention to or crafting their training around. Really isn't that great of a metric. It's slow to respond to quick changes in workload. It doesn't necessarily reflect a lot of different psychological and physiological changes that happen during exercise, but also in your everyday life. And they thought, and now we think too, that there's a lot of things that could be done better to really give a better picture of, for example, during exercise, how hard you're working, perhaps how you're feeling, how to steer it better within a desired goal for whatever your run is or whatever your training plan is, and that potentially also applies to everything outside of exercise as well. So we've been exploring that also recently, the kind of 24/7 concept of how can we make this more useful for the user. And is the answer really in a wrist-worn wearable too? There's so many other types of tech that have really exploded, from garments to rings to earables that are increasingly common, and we're keeping the scope wide to see what's useful. Can we keep it low friction and the easiest for the user? What's the simplest way that we can collect data and feed it back to ultimately lead to some sort of behavior change, that actually reflects what the people want, which is not necessarily keeping their heart rate at 90% of their max, but rather feeling better when they run, or maybe finding a rhythm in their run, or being able to sustain their run more, and perhaps not start too fast and after 2 weeks of running get burnt out and not be able to finish an 8-week program. So that's kind of the perspective we were going from, and that's very large and wide, but ultimately trying to make wearables more useful, both from the construction and the implementation, and also the application of what is it gathering, what is it feeding it back, and then that kind of human computer interaction as well, to how you're interacting with this or that. So Yeah.
Wonderful. And so how do you see the sort of the breathing side and the wearable tech and the running side, like how is that all kind of coming together for you and your team? And like what are the sort of the big like key learnings at the moment? Like if you were, which you are, you know, in front of a group of people who were either really passionate runners or really keen breathers, like what are those key points that you're like, these are the things that are really starting to come out of what we're discovering?
Sure. So I guess a good place to start would be like, I was a later arrival in our research group and was really lucky to work with one of the professors in our group is a psychophysiologist, which is a new-ish title that some of the sports psychologists are self-labeling, which is actually, I think, a very good one as we start to realize the connection between so many physiological variables, like certain aspects of breathing, and psychological variables, because we know that they are literally, you know, physically via the nervous system and also metaphorically so closely tied together. So in this case, this psychophysiologist had stumbled upon a lot of good research and done a lot of it himself related to the importance of breathing rate as a metric in its own, of just the speed of your breathing, right? Also called respiratory frequency in a lot of the literature. And in the simplest way, I mean, it is a great metric that tells you a lot about a person. And it at rest, it tells us a number of things related to sympathetic, parasympathetic balance, state anxiety and arousal, as well, perhaps fear response and pain, a couple other things. During exercise, it's also very good. It's virtually the only variable that has a linear and very good sensitive correlation with workload. So physical workload being, you know, if you're working at a given intensity, we can predict that pretty well with just how fast you're breathing. And of course, there's individual variability. I might breathe at a different speed as you at a jogging pace. But it's really sensitive to changes in workload. So if I run up a hill, it changes very fast. And if I go down the hill and relax, then that also is very sensitive to change. So that opened up this awareness of a simple variable, a simple perspective that we could potentially push, something to look at that is on the surface very simple, but underneath actually very complex, and tells us a lot of things about how hard someone's working and how they're feeling. And that really started to draw the link for us between motion and emotion, which ultimately is the goal of the project from a 20,000-foot perspective. So bringing it back also to the wearables goal, with the newish knowledge that breathing rate was such a good metric that tells us so much, we thought we should use this as a new kind of guiding factor for our wearables. So we started using a variety of methods and examining the accuracy and the usability of some of these methods to really detect breathing rate, specifically during running. There's a number of different ways you can do it at rest. Of course, you can simply count on a watch. You could use a microphone, whatever else. But during exercise, there's a number of different constraints that cause us to have to kind of re-examine it in a new way. So what we're looking at now is monitoring breathing as an important not only performance but also psychophysiological variable during running, and perhaps other aspects of breathing as well. So monitoring that, and then perhaps looking forward, manipulating that and teaching people how to breathe better, whatever better means. That's a whole other. We'll save that one for later.
That's awesome. And I'm curious, when you just mentioned then about that sort of 20,000-foot view of the research of motion and emotion. Can you talk a bit about that? I think that's
yeah, for sure. So I guess I'm talking about an application of that already, right? A way that we took that motif and are bringing it into running. But you know, the project as a whole, there's also people working on skiing. There's some people working on walking and hiking, and that is really the link that I think some of our industry partners and also some of the researchers on the scientific team we saw that as lacking in a lot of sport and scientific inquiry in our field of sports science for quite a few years. And maybe going back to kind of where we started and what we were talking about just before we logged onto this call, it's been like an awakening, I think, for a lot of people, within elite sport and also recreational sport, and starting to realize, like, there's strength coaches waking up saying, like, why didn't I know about this earlier? Why didn't I know about breathing before? Or why didn't I pay attention to heart rate variability? All these things are linked, and we've been siloing ourselves, where, especially, I don't know, in the culture, in American professional culture, specialty credentials have really flourished in the last 30 years and prevented some of this, like, interlinking, interdisciplinary work. So in this case, we really saw it as important for of course the recreational athlete, but also sports and perhaps even outside of sports as well, to start to draw that link, to understand that there is a link, and that ignoring it is possibly missing out on one of the most valuable things that we can deliver to people, either via wearables or via perhaps non-technical solutions as well. So that's taken a lot of work just to get where we are now, but we have a lot of different directions right now across a variety of sports and groups that are all looking at that fundamental question of somehow linking motion and emotion.
Beautiful. That's wonderful. It sounds like such an exciting project to be a part of. And so what, like, you mentioned as well that, there's obviously quite a few different people in the team that are working, like, it's not just about running, like, that's the area that you're obviously sort of specializing in. Is there anything that you've started to notice, or as a collective you've started to notice, that are kind of like really big similarities or really big differentiations between, say, some of the different sports that you're looking at with regards to, say, the breathing, the wearable and the breathing thing?
Well, of course, I mean, working across so many different sports previously, like, that's what I'm drawn to, is trying to see what's in common than rather what's different necessarily. And well, I'd have to admit that I'm a little jealous of the ski project, because I would also like to be working on that. It's so the really interesting commonality for me right now is looking at the aspect of human-computer interaction, which is we actually have a separate research group here in Salzburg that's specifically focused on that. So how you interact with this, and your experience with hitting buttons and receiving feedback, and how you interact with these devices and data, and that the way that ties into wearables and every sport and so many things even outside of sport has been really fascinating for us. So kind of bringing it back to some of those aspects of wearables I said before, of being low friction is a consistent theme among us, that we want to with any sort of guidance or any sort of coaching perhaps that we put into a device or a system, being low friction and making it very easy and almost subconscious for someone to interact with. That's really, really important. So a good example, perhaps, and happy to get into this later, if we want somebody to synchronize their cadence, their running or something with a beat, with music, or with some sort of a metronome, do we really need to instruct somebody to do that first, or how can we design that in a way that we can just feed it to them and it's almost automatic, that entrainment, that synchronization just happens automatically, and somehow taking advantage of a variety of things we know about psychology and feedback learning, and making that experience as pleasant and, again, as low friction as possible. That's been a really cool discovery and something we're continuing to chew on in our group.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. That's really cool. And
Yeah.
how would you say on a personal level, being involved in this project, because what I heard you say before was that you weren't initially interested in the breath, like it was not something, you know, as again when we talked last week, you mentioned about how you were so heavily involved in sports growing up, but there was no tuition, no guidance around the breath for you as a young athlete. And, you know, now kind of being involved in this project, and I assume that, you know, you were introduced to sort of breath work before you jumped into this project, but how has it shifted your own practices and your own experience of sport and athletics?
Sure. Well, I mean, this sounds cheesy, but completely. Like I went for a run yesterday with one of my colleagues, and we ran up the mountain in my backyard, which is steep and grueling. And you know, running uphill is already an extremely challenging, you know, sufferfest, and it instantly, the stress that it places on you forces you to adapt your breathing as well as other things in very abrupt and sometimes subtle ways. So using some of the tools that we've learned over the last, you know, couple of years have been huge, and I immediately and automatically switched to those things now, which has been really cool. So zooming back, I so to speak, growing up in running and all these other sports, yeah, nobody talked about breathing as something that could be altered. You know, it was assumed that you breathed as you needed to, and that was just accepted, and there were individual differences, sure, but it wasn't necessarily something you could control or improve. And where we're at now, I feel that could not be farther from the truth. And, you know, I remember specific interactions with people. For example, one of the exercise physiologists for the Canadian Olympic team, who I had asked, because I had heard, I don't remember, some reference of nasal breathing during exercise, and I asked her, you know, hey, what's this about? Is that something worth talking or thinking about? What do you know about this? And was quickly dismissed as probably pseudoscience, something that there's no scientific backing for, and that is not worth exploring. Some of the recent readings and connecting these disparate, you know, pockets of research, as well as kind of ancestral knowledge, expert opinion, all this other stuff that we're now looking at in the last 1 to 2 years. I mean, I wish I had known then, because now we know actually there's a lot of evidence for this. There's a lot of reasons that it works, that it should work. That it's not universal necessarily, but it's at the very least worth talking and thinking about. So although disappointed that I didn't discover it earlier when I was competing, who knows, it could have unlocked a different level, or at least a different enjoyment. I'm very glad to have discovered it now. And it's amazing seeing, like, there seems to be a convergence on this. You know, all these different fields from yoga, of course, to CrossFit, to other kinds of performance science, to, I mean, even the keyboard warrior, and understanding the relevance of this, not only for the elite athlete, but also for the just everyday human. It's amazing to see the kind of renewed attention on this, and it is very affirming, at least for what we're working on, to know that, hey, it's not just us. Like, everybody's starting to realize that this is worth talking about, this is worth studying, worth trying, experimenting, and also seems especially I don't know, relevant in the midst of a respiratory virus going around the world.
100%, and that's something that both Lucy and I feel really strongly about, is lung health, right? It's even before COVID, it was still something that we were both sort of highly aware of, and now, you know, the lungs are the organ that are being attacked by this virus. So there is no better time to be working on this. So I'm really curious, you talked about how, you know, you went for this grueling run this morning, did you say? Or yesterday?
Yesterday.
Yesterday. And you utilized some of the things that you'd learned. Now, of course, there's, you know, there's going to be people in our group who would love to join you on a grueling run. And there are those who, you know, probably just sort of jogging to the local shops would be enough. You know, we all have our different likes and dislikes, obviously. But what are the, you know, what are the sort of the primary things for you? What are the primary takeaways that you could share for people who are wanting to up their runs, get into running, or even if they're not big runners themselves, but they have a runner who comes to them as one of their clients, and you know, maybe they ask them a question of like, hey, do you know anything about breathing for runners? Like, what would you impart to people?
Sure. Well, this is big. I mean, this is the whole thing. I could expand upon this in a bunch of different directions, but to boil it down, the breathing that I'm utilizing during running right now is mostly grounded in some of the simple stuff, with perhaps some extra toppings of some of the advanced techniques thrown in occasionally. So the simplest things I would say, I mean, one, breathing rate, sort of, if you can breathe slower in some way, that probably has beneficial effects on your performance and on your psychophysiology, right? On your experience of running, your feeling of being relaxed, of perhaps experiencing flow or some other sort of you know, positive psychological experience. So if you can somehow slow down your breathing, that's massive. And there are a number of ways to do that, but an easy one is simply perhaps breathing just 2 or 5 breaths slower per minute, right? We can record our breathing rate. We know that most people at a jogging pace breathe at about maybe 35 breaths per minute. That's quite normal. And we think that there's substantial benefit simply to slowing that down to about 30. So breathing rate is a big one. However, the relationship between breathing rate and depth of breathing is essential and reciprocal. So if you breathe slower, your body still needs a given amount of oxygen to exert itself at a certain intensity. So you must breathe deeper. And whether or not the best strategy to breathe slower is by breathing deeper, or vice versa, you know, breathe deeper by breathing slower, I don't know which one is better necessarily. So then we're getting into the coaching of it. You know, do I instruct you to practice some deep breathing before the run, which is going to then perhaps have some, you know, retention or memory into you breathing slower during the run? Or do we instruct people to breathe slower and they will thus breathe deeper because they have to, for reasons of blood buffering and a number of other things? Those are the biggest concepts that I think so many people could really gather a lot of benefit from. And really, from what you started with, I mean, sure, there's like a ton of elite athletes who can benefit from this, but they already know, a lot of them already know about this because some coach or physiologist or strength coach, you know, brought it up to them before. The people that this could benefit the most, perhaps, is actually those you know, recreational runners and the people who are just getting started jogging, where the magnitude of the benefit is so much greater, especially because they don't have these really entrenched movement and breathing patterns. Perhaps it's a bit more flexible for them to actually learn some of these good habits earlier on. It's not so hard to break some of the bad habits. So breathing rate and depth, those are a good place to start. If you can breathe deeper and breathe slower, there's gonna be a number of different mechanisms in your body that it will affect, right? Such as alveolar respiration, you'll get better oxygen perfusion all throughout your body. You'll utilize more of your anatomical dead space, right? The space in your lung that doesn't really get used. We can open that up with longer, deeper breaths. And we know this from a lot of the good study in yoga and meditation breathing science, right? Which there's a number of different groups out of India and actually a group in Washington that are doing this good work. So moving on from there, because these things are also related, I would say the next things are probably nasal breathing and active exhales. So these are a little less studied, but still very effective. And they really relate to the first one. So nasal breathing, I know you talk and think about a lot already, and is essential for doing in everyday life. I mean, our nose is our primary breathing apparatus. Our mouth should be for what? Speaking and talk and laughing and smiling and eating, right? And there's a number of reasons why breathing through the nose is much more effective also during exercise. You know, when we think about the release of free-flowing nitric oxide, and actually some of the restriction as well, because we can't get as much air through our nose, it forces us to breathe slower, which, as we just talked about, that reciprocal relationship will force you to breathe deeper and has all those other benefits and kind of cascading effects on the body. So nose breathing is a big one. Most people from a variety of research, actually way back in the 80s, most people can breathe through their nose up to about 80 to 85% intensity in their exercise. So 80, 85% maximum heart rate, which is way higher than we thought. You know, if you tell somebody breathe through your nose during this jog, on the first jog, they will have a hard time, but this can be learned, and it can actually be learned quite fast. We think about 1 or 2 weeks, most people can adapt to nose breathing during exercise, during running, until about that we would say that's about moderate to high intensity level. So number of benefits there, and we could unpack that way deeper, of course, as well. The other kind of, I would say, like level 2 breathing technique that's useful is this active exhale. And I'm just starting to get really hooked on this because I think it's understudied and potentially very valuable, not only in exercise, but actually also at rest. So sometimes this is easier to draw, but if you can imagine our resting tidal volume, the depth of our breathing lies in a certain range of sort of pulmonary capacity, of our lung capacity. And when we start to exercise, that widens, right? We take bigger inhales, we take bigger exhales. The normal response at really high intensities is we tend to take bigger and bigger inhales, but we don't really take bigger exhales. There's a certain point where we reach a limit where we no longer dip into what's called our expiratory reserve. And that has a range of kind of dangers for our body and for our experience of running, which one of them is alveolar hyperinflation, which actually gives us those feelings of breathlessness and can cause feelings of anxiety as we get that kind of feedback from our vagal nerve. So an active exhale, as I think of it, or at least this is what I'm calling it, is a longer and stronger exhale. And I think there's a lot to be explored here. So when we, and perhaps this calls for like a redefining of the breath cycle, where we usually talk about the inhale being the first part of the breath, right? In and out, in and out. That's how people coach it. That's how we're told by our sport coaches or by a doctor when we're sitting on a medical table, take a deep breath in. When we're exercising, when you know, as all mammals actually, as they start to have increased ventilatory demands, for example, during exercise, the actual group, the parafacial respiratory group, which is actually a nerve and musculature of your face, is actually responsible for expiration, for exhaling. That becomes the nerve group that actually fires first. They know this from a bunch of different research where they've anesthetized different mammals, and we can see, well, is it the inhale or is it the exhale that comes first, in chicken or the egg? And it's actually the exhale. So that's perhaps a terminology, I don't know, hang up. I don't want to get too deep in, but when we think about the exhale as the first part of the breath, and if we can cue people to take deeper, longer exhales, it has a number of different effects, right? We know from at rest, when we take longer exhales, the effect on respiratory sinus arrhythmia and heart rate variability and what that does to parasympathetic drive is very real. Perhaps we can keep our heart rate just a little bit lower during running by using longer exhales. And then by using more strong exhales, or we say more complete exhales, like I talked about that range, if we can dip farther into that expiratory reserve, what we're actually doing is we're getting that diaphragm to move even farther up and really using that elastic energy to get a lot deeper of an inhale. So if you want to take deep inhales and get more oxygen in, the best way to do that is actually by taking a bigger exhale. And they have that, we're utilizing that elastic energy of the diaphragm. You're spreading out the metabolic cost of breathing by using more of your expiratory muscles, which is primarily your internal oblique, as well as the rectus abdominis, external oblique, et cetera. And perhaps then also the diaphragm works at a better place in its length tension relationship. So you end up working less hard to breathe at the same speed by getting that deeper, fuller, longer exhale. So this active exhale concept, there's a lot to it, and I can't claim that it's mine. There's some really good work by a guy, Ian Jackson, who is now deceased. He had written a book, actually, great book called Yoga and the Athlete back in, I think, 1979, and trained some of the US Olympic cycling team. His work was almost completely forgotten. And luckily his son has been doing some of his work under the title of Breath Play, and really stumbled upon this, but it was hardly touched by the scientific community, and I have not heard of it being coached to any other athletes or recreational runners or weekend warriors since then. So there's a lot to explore there, and I would love to see some more kind of evidence to back that up. The last piece of it perhaps being and this is silly, but well, it's silly to me. It's not silly to you, because probably this happens a lot in yoga and breath work, is making some sort of noise on the exhale. So again, the active exhale, if we can, there seems to be some backing to the humming or the singing or just the noise, that some people have recommended we do on our exhale. I think we knew it worked, right? People knew that this worked 2,000 years ago, but they didn't really know why. And now they're starting to discover, a hum on the exhale seems to open up the nasal sinuses to actually allow more free-flowing nitric oxide, to open up the airway even more, to have better perfusion during our breathing. And there seems to be also something just for making a sound through perhaps pursed lips or singing or using a word, during your breathing, because of its effect on breathing rate. Because if you can slow down that exhale, you're breathing slower, you're breathing deeper, you have all these other peripheral effects of breathing that very quickly, become kind of a positive feedback loop, right? So the deeper breath causes you to breathe slower, the slower breath causes you to breathe deeper. So perhaps there's something to the sound or the humming, but that really begs some more exploration. So I'd be happy to hear from you if you have any other thoughts on that.
Love this. This is so interesting, and I've not. The thing that I've not heard anything about was, as you said, that like reframing the breath so that the exhale is the first one, and it really, I really resonate with that, and I mentioned this very briefly in a comment to someone on the group the other day, because she was actually asking, one lady was asking a few questions. One was about free diving, one was about cycling, and one was about labor. Now, I'm not really a cyclist, and I've not done a stack of free diving, but I've definitely gone through labor. And so I shared my experiences on, very briefly around breathing through labor. And what came up to me as you were talking was that was very much especially in the latter stages, like the actual kind of birthing stages, I was in that, what you described, where I could inhale and inhale and inhale and inhale and inhale. And I had to be reminded to exhale, to exhale, to exhale. And it was the hardest freaking thing for me to do. Like, it was so simple, but it was all up here. So it's just that, the exhale. And as you were talking, and I was sort of recalling that and seeing this connection. And obviously, the exhale, we very much connect to the parasympathetic part of the nervous system, and the inhale to the sympathetic part of the nervous system. And obviously, not that I felt unsafe in childbirth, but it's not exactly the most pleasant experience. So your nervous system is on high alert. So I guess what was sort of coming through to me in terms of like taking it back to sport is this necessity for us to really have that harmony in our nervous system. Because if you are somebody that is naturally kind of, has more anxiety or is quite highly strung, then your tendency is going to be to get stuck in that state of that sort of inhaling and that challenge to exhale. So that's kind of what came through with that. And just in terms of starting with the exhale, I just think that's just such an awesome reframe. And I think that it is partly such an amazing reframe because of this whole piece of the nervous system. And this is something that Lucy and I talk a lot about on this course, because as we spoke about last week, this is a course that's really kind of the foundations and the fundamentals of breathing and understanding dysfunction. And we talk a lot about the nervous system for that reason, because we have created this course in response to what we see and what we experience with our clients, which is a lot of very highly strung, high anxiety, disembodied people needing to embody and needing to repair their nervous system. So being able to put the exhale first takes that focus off of the inhale, which is, the sympathetic nervous system, which in yoga is that fire, is that like upward energy. And we're all, none of us need more upward energy. We're needing that sort of calming. So changing that to have that focus on this is the first one, to me, it's so subtle, but I think it has the potential to be so insanely profound.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, it's a paradigm shift, and we're going up against, a lot of the medical community and maybe hundreds of years of description of calling the inhale, first. But we can't deny, the true value of like attention, and whichever one we say first is often what people remember, right? People remember the first and last of something. So calling the inhale first, I think draws attention to it, where if you really care about the inhale, perhaps we should pay more attention to the exhale. And that's, I think, why this strategy could be valuable during running, but also outside of running. So it's funny, going back to childbirth, when we look at some of the research in evolutionary anatomy, which I am super interested in. I have to admit, I was geeky about barefoot running back in the day. It's not the panacea we once thought it was. We looked at skulls of Australopithecus afarensis and all these other specimens, and what you can now see, if you look up in the literature, there's this point in human history, actually about 500,000 years ago, when we started to be able to give birth to big-headed babies. And when we look at the structure of the diaphragm and the costal diaphragm, which is of course responsible for breathing, but versus the crural diaphragm, the middle part, which did not evolve to breathe, is almost inactive during the breathing cycle, evolved for different reasons. So it's the thing that's responsible for gag reflex and for coughing, for vomiting, but also a lot of these evolutionary anthropologists seem to believe it was responsible for our ability to birth big-headed babies. So there's a link here also to your diaphragm is not only the main, ventilatory pump muscle, but it also enables us to give birth to these bigger, smarter babies that other mammals can't. So it's this miracle muscle that is horrendously understudied and misunderstood. So that's a funny link that you drew there.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing that part. And I'm also really curious, a little bit before you talked about like some of the ancestral like learnings or understandings with regards to this topic. Like what are you referring to when you say that? What are some of those ancestral understandings?
So I guess here I would refer to, I don't have the book handy. I read this great book, Breath by James Nestor recently, that got into a lot of this, and I should credit him for this, of doing a really good job breaking down some of the previous ancestral knowledge and somehow integrating that into what we now know. But among his and perhaps the evolutionary anthropology that I just talked about also links in here of what we know humans used to do, and this other like cultural knowledge within the yoga spheres and other essentially like historical breath work. I mean, this stuff holds a lot of value, and people didn't really know why until recently. So a classic example is like the so visible Wim Hof stuff that he has done a good job bringing to the forefront, and although quite limited and perhaps not the one size fits all that they're pushing, the techniques that he was tapping into and actually bringing in from are Toma meditation, which is a very good technique that we've now been able to establish has very profound effects on the autonomic nervous system. Right. I mean, they can trigger sympathetic drive to do a ton of different things to cause almost an instant increase in free flowing epinephrine, adrenaline in your body. That can have a lot of use, for example, before an intense athletic endeavor. Right. So that's just one example, but across that, I mean, there's also tons of work in different styles of yoga, breathing, and meditation, and all this other stuff that it's like people have known this for thousands of years, but we weren't really able to say why or if it actually worked. And now with the tools that we have, like some of these wearable sensors and some of the laboratory spirometry equipment where we can really examine gases and oxygen, CO2 kinetics and things like that, now being able to establish the reasons why they work and pick that apart and think about, this works for this reason, maybe we should combine it with this. This is more suitable during running, whereas this is maybe more useful after running, right? We perhaps some of these techniques that stimulate sympathetic response will be really useful before like a race, if you're running a 5K, whereas afterwards, immediately after or perhaps later in the day, very useful for recovery reasons, to speed up your a number of different kind of recovery mechanisms, both metabolic and pulmonary, in order to feel fresher the next day, or to be able to wake up and go to work without issue at 8 a.m. So admittedly, I need to get a lot more into that. I really I'm working on right now trying to organize some of these techniques and being able to connect, okay, this came from this style of meditation that was established 3,000 years ago, and how does that link in now to what we're potentially trying to coach people to do during running. But a lot of other people are working on this, and that's been really, really encouraging. So knowing that it's being looked at and it's not being ignored anymore is, I think, really cool. And that's a great blending, where and that's really what we should be doing in the scientific community, is looking at, they already knew this. We're not making anything up. We're trying to connect these worlds and understand, well, how do we blend this kind of ancestral knowledge, expert opinion, or like what athletes, coaches are already doing just because they feel that it works. And how do we start to provide that with some more substance and connect these worlds so that we can potentially improve it for all of us.
Yeah, I love that. And just making it so much more mainstream, which it already is becoming, which is so great. And that's what I'm so grateful that these teachings are becoming more accessible and more mainstream. And just not just athletes, not just yogis, but people teaching their kids and people teaching their grandmas and helping people to breathe better because they have asthma and things like that. Is it's so lovely. And I guess we're actually coming almost to the top of the hour, so we won't do I know that goes so quick, doesn't it? We won't do any questions, but because I feel like we're just on a really good roll. Just finally, because one of the questions that we were asked was, we had a question about free diving, which Lucy had spoken to a little bit, and she had previously done a video, and about cycling. So I'm just curious that you shared some of those sort of breathing sort of awarenesses or exercises that you would recommend to do during running. is it wildly different from your opinion and expertise depending on the sport that you're doing? Like, would you have like really dramatically different practices that you would suggest to people, or are they, would you say they're fairly similar?
Good question. I mean, to separate sport perhaps into like cyclical endurance sport versus everything else is perhaps a good division. So, you know, I would treat my breathing very differently in running and jogging than I would during weightlifting, right? Interestingly, there's a ton of good knowledge out of like weightlifting, for example, where we know that, you know, a weight belt happens to, when coupled with the right breathing techniques, increase intra-abdominal pressure so that you can, you know, squat 800 pounds. They've known that, and they've been doing that for decades. Freediving has a unique set of constraints where you're obviously trying to maximize breath hold, and some of the research and also just knowledge out of that community is amazing and has really pushed forward specifically our knowledge of breath holding and CO2 tolerance, which is really, really cool. And a lot of that applies to swimming as well. So in other environments with like constrained oxygen availability, right? So another good example is just some of the hypoxia work that they've used in swimming of getting people to kind of replicate the demands of altitude training by just breathing less voluntarily during swimming. That seems to work. The space that I'm working in right now, and that makes me most curious, is again like the cyclical endurance sports. And of course, we're not ignoring these other ones. There's a lot that can be learned from them. But when we think, so cyclical endurance sports, you know, thinking about running, perhaps hiking even, but cycling for sure, which I do a lot of gravel biking and mountain biking and some bike packing, other things. And a number of these other sports where you think, you know, that there is a cycle, and there's a long duration effort where we're pushing into certain energy systems where breathing can perhaps have a large, very impactful benefit or harm on your performance and enjoyment. That's to me the most interesting right now. So we didn't get into, I talked about kind of the first two levels of our like breath tools is what we're calling them. We didn't get into like the level 3. And one of the things that we're starting to think and talk about and study is synchronization, syncing your breath, right? Coupling it with your stride in the case of running. That's a cool paradigm though that is really worth exploring. So for anybody in these sports, thinking about your breathing in terms of cycles per breath seems to be really, really useful. So they've looked at this in running as well as in cycling, in rowing, kayaking, a couple other sports. And for me, for example, the thing that I use usually in my running, if I'm running at an easy pace on flat ground, and maybe I can demonstrate it, I might so I'm inhaling for 2 steps and exhaling for 3 steps. And I might even slow that down or extend that ratio. But thinking about my breathing in terms of like steps or cycles per breath has been a really, really useful paradigm that applies to a lot of the things we talked about. So using an odd ratio, for example, I just had, if I'm doing 2-3, I have a longer exhale than my inhale. And I could get really carried away here, but it seems to be for a lot of people a really useful, actually mental exercise, because it gives you something to think about. That's not your stride either, where we know consciously trying to alter or pay attention to your stride during running is actually harmful. Paying attention to your breath and having that kind of synchronization, that tempo to fixate on, seems to be really, really useful and gives us an awesome psychological cue to tap into, and gives us feeling of flow where we can, you know, there's a rhythmic stimuli, there's a challenge and skill, hopefully somewhere converging. And that's a really cool thing to think about. I think that applies to perhaps all cyclical endurance sport. So that's cycles per breath. So there's a bit of work that needs to be done on that. But hopefully we'll have some knowledge to share at the end of this year on that.
Awesome. I used to run when I was a bit younger, and I do remember very intuitively doing that, like syncing my breath up to my pace. And so just to clarify, maybe this is the research that you are currently sort of doing, but would you recommend people sync their pace to their breath, or their breath to their pace?
Yeah, that could be very valuable. So a lot of elite cyclists have used this actually. If you can get access to a good audio track of like the Tour de France, I guarantee you'll hear people doing that. And there seemed to be a lot of reason for that when we look at muscle contraction and the way that the diaphragm actually acts as like a second circulatory pump. There seems to be some reason that it actually can help with blood flow in the body. As well, I think that the mental benefits are amazing. So the entrainment and having an internal cue to focus on that is not technique necessarily. I think it's super useful, and you can manipulate that ratio and perhaps like shift gears, so to speak, that way according to different intensities quite easily with that ratio. You can extend the exhale or shorten both, etc. And it seems to be very valuable. The one also that it applies to in running, which not necessarily for cycling or hiking or rowing, is also side stitch. So this is a very real problem that a lot of people experience and is still quite misunderstood. Some people, when they run, they get this feeling of like pain or tickling sometimes in their abdomen, and some people still are unsure whether it's really caused by breathing or whether it's caused by fluid intake or other things. There seems to be a connection between landing on the same foot during every exhale. So common people who experience stitch commonly exhale on their right foot, and with an odd ratio, like I just tried to demonstrate, I don't know how good I did, with an odd ratio, I am therefore alternating which foot that I'm exhaling on every breath cycle, right? Because in that case, a 2-3 breathing, that's 5 steps, right, per cycle. I'm alternating whether I breathe out on my right or left. Potentially it can prevent side stitch. So for a very real contingent of runners who get this physical pain that causes them to stop running, perhaps this can unlock a whole different level of it can prevent that discomfort and make running more comfortable, which is more enjoyable, which means that for that recreational runner, maybe not the elite because they figured it out on their own, for that recreational runner, if this is the thing that's preventing them from finishing their, couch to 10K program, this can really benefit their life.
Wow, that is fascinating. Super fascinating.
I'm glad you think so too.
Yeah. And no doubt our people will. Awesome. Well, Eric, thank you so much. This has just been so interesting, and you've shared some absolute nuggets that I know that, especially those who are watching who have that interest in sports, even if it's just from a very, very sort of pleasure-based personal perspective, I know will have gained so much from this talk. So thank you. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing. And just quickly, if people do want to, be able to sort of contact you and just understand more about what you're doing, how can people reach you?
Sure. I mean, probably the best way is just email. I'm happy for you to share my email in the group if you want. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, but it's quite non-professional. You're going to find just GoPro videos of me cycling and skiing. So I'm on LinkedIn and ResearchGate for academic and professional things, and I do some consulting as on demand if people are really curious. But right now I'm very just invested in the research stuff. So I mean, the coolest way to connect is hopefully to share some research down the line, and hopefully to be able to maybe do this again when we have some more stuff to talk about.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Let's definitely stay in touch, and we'd love to hear where your research goes. It's so on point to what we're talking about. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. You as well.
Thanks.
Ciao, Rachel.
Bye.
Bye.